Welcome to another episode of We Don't Die. I'm your host, Sandra Champlain, author of the international best-selling book called We Don't Die, A Skeptic's Discovery of Life After Death. And just a reminder, our home base is wedon'tdie.com, where you can always find our free Sunday gathering with medium demonstrations, join one of our medium classes, or find out about our Facebook and Patreon communities. Now, this is a video interview. So if you are listening and you would rather be watching myself and my wonderful guests, just head over to YouTube and type in We Don't Die 405. I'm so excited to share our guests with you today. We have two friends, both New York Times bestselling authors with over 50 years of investigating life after death. Dr. Raymond Moody is the leading authority on the near-death experience, a phrase he coined in the late 70s. His groundbreaking work, Life After Life, completely changed the way we view death and dying, and has sold more than 13 million copies worldwide. Paul Perry is the co-author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, including The Light Beyond with Raymond Moody, Saved by the Light with Dannion Brinkley, and Evidence of the Afterlife with Dr. Jeffrey Long. He has co-written a dozen of books on near-death experiences, 4 of them with Dr. Moody, and directed 2 popular documentary films on the subject. And the most exciting news is they have a brand new book together called Proof of Life After Life, 7 Reasons to Believe There Is an Afterlife. Of course, you can visit Dr. Moody's website at lifeafterlife.com and Paul's site at paulperryproductions.com. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to We Don't Die Radio.
Hi there.
Hello. Thank you so much for this invitation.
Well, I'm excited not just to share you, but it's 2 for the price of 1 today. 2 wonderful gentlemen and me. How lucky am I? How did you 2 first meet, if I can ask that question?
Oh, that was interesting. Raymond was working on a book. At the time, was working title was Light Beyond. That's what it ended up being called. And I was editing a major health magazine in New York called American Health. And my agent took me out to lunch one day and he said, hey, would you mind giving Dr. Raymond Moody a hand in writing a book? And I said, I don't even know who Dr. Moody is. And he said, really? He named the near-death experience and defined it. And I said, I don't know what a near-death experience is. And so Nat, our agent, says, and he's an abrupt guy. And he says, I can't believe it. You're editing a major health magazine. You're not smart enough to know what a near-death experience is. You need to go meet Raymond Moody and study this whole field. And so that's what I did. I went to Atlanta. Raymond was living in Carrollton at the time, Georgia. And we talked about the book, The Light Beyond. We hit it off right away. And one thing leads to another. And since then, we've written, this is our 6th book together. Proof of Life After Life is our 6th book. And one book always leads to a question, and the question that needs to be answered. And so that's what we do. We'll write a book, and all of a sudden there'll be, with The Light Beyond, it was, there's nothing in this book about children and near-death experiences. And Raymond said, well, there's not much research being done on it, but he directed me to Melvin Morse in Seattle. And I went to see Melvin, and we wrote 4 books on children and near-death experiences and other aspects of the near-death experience. And 3 of those were New York Times bestsellers. And then it would go on and on. We'd have question after question, book after book, and that's what we did from that point to now, is answer these questions.
Incredible. Right. Dr. Moody, you remember when you met Paul?
I certainly do. And Paul and I think we have a great, working team here, because I just tell you the truth. All the people who know me very well will tell you it's true. But in fact, I am such a bore in the way I think.
Oh,
All right. Listen, I was a professor of philosophy and logic, and my lifelong thing since the age of 18 is ancient Greek philosophy. Well, there's a bestseller for you, right? So, what I'm getting at is this is not most people's fare, but it's how I got interested in this. From Plato studied this, and the early Greek philosophers knew about these things. That's how I found out about it in the long run. But, a philosopher is not going to be the right person to present some of this information to the average person, I think. And so I tend to talk in abstractions and and put the information in that context. Whereas Paul can say, "Hey, just a minute here, professor. That doesn't make any sense to what way." And we together we come up with a way, I think, to present information that is sometimes very, complex.
yeah.
Hopefully, in a way that just people will relate to it and benefit from it primarily.
Yeah.
And what I have to say also that Raymond is one of probably the most exciting and interesting person I know. And for reasons just stated, is he knows everything.
Oh, no.
Well,
I know enough to know I don't know hardly anything is the right I am.
He knows nothing about the Yankees or the LA Dodgers.
No. I do know about the professional wrestling, though.
That's true.
Keep up
That's another subject, though.
We need to follow our passions, right? We can't talk
Right.
about the
That's
afterlife.
right. But
24/7.
this topic that you're interested in, Sandra, and Paul and I are interested in. I mean, it's been my experience beginning at age 18, actually, that when people reach a certain age, it's and especially so, I think that people who've been so successful that they've spent their lifetime focusing on their business or the busy work and just focusing on that side of life and have been very done that very well in that side of life. When they reach a certain age, say 50s, 60s, 70s, they begin to wake up to this question of life after death, which has been put aside or thought of as trivial, or it doesn't happen, and then they just automatically wake up to it. By the way, that reason I found out about that at age 18 was I read it in my hero Plato, my first philosophy class in September of '62. Reading the first few pages of Plato's Republic, I decided then and there to shift from astronomy, which is what I went there to study, immediately to philosophy. Because why is Plato's work still in print at any store 2,300 years? People should ask themselves that. Well, number one, because it is amazing, terrific stuff. And this Republic is about, in the end, a near-death experience. It starts with this old guy who's been very successful in life. He says, and Socrates, who's then about 20, meets the old guy and says, Cephalos, what's it like from your point of view? Oh, Cephalos says, I've been very successful in my business, made a lot of money. I've spent all time on my business, and now here I am. I saw all those stories I heard about the afterlife when I was a kid, coming back, and these people developed this sense of urgency. Then in a later Plato dialogue I read that same semester, he talked about the importance of this question of life after death. So that's how I got into this. And it came from Greek philosophy, where it was a big point of study. And so that is and yet, of course, all the other things too that people are concerned about, because after I got my PhD in philosophy and as a philosophy professor, I went into psychiatry with my specific interest in it being why people kill people. From a law enforcement family, I rode in a cop car when I was a kid. I mean, my brother, a sheriff, my two uncles, sheriffs or chief of police, two cousins. I mean, my dad worked for the DEA as a surgeon for this drug stuff. And you see how it is, So to me, this big question, which I studied from early on, is why in the world would somebody kill somebody? So I studied that in psychiatry, and I worked in a unit for the criminally insane that was full of these people that you read about in the National Enquirer. Was my daily work. And so through all of this, I have developed just I think, a great peace in one respect, with respect to the question of life after death. And not through a logical process exactly, because there's great logical difficulties in trying to prove an afterlife. But thinking it through myself, I just give up. To me, it looks like, yeah, there's a life after death. As counterintuitive as it still seems to me, and having no template from childhood it's like my dad was sarcastic about religion when I was a kid. He, all right, a surgeon, a medic in World War II of the Pacific, the things he must have seen. But he was just sarcastic about religion, so I was free of it. And mostly our friends were Jewish because they didn't mind that dad was surgeon, was, not going to all these church things. And so, I was free in that environment, and then just to inquire. So, but always debating with myself about it. It's this thing about oxygen deprivation to the brain. I'm sorry, that's baloney, but people have got to hold on to that, and I'll explain why. All right. And that is, this information is so challenging that most people are afraid of it. They really are. So it has to be tamed by the society to have some sort of customary framework to talk about it. And the framework we have goes right back to Plato and Democritus, the Greek philosopher who lived about the same thing. Democritus, the atomist, said, oh, this is just residual biological activity and from the atoms, and there's no such thing as a moment of death. That's why this experience occurs. Plato said, oh, no, this is real, about the same debate we have today, right? And so I realized quickly that debate is meaningless because, number one, people have the same experience identically who are not themselves ill or injured or going through a resuscitation, but rather who are there in the presence of somebody who is dying. And as that happens, it's a very frequent occurrence that people standing around say things like, oh, as grandma was dying, I lifted out of my body. I started going toward this light with my grandma. Or people say, as grandma was dying, apparitions of the dying person's loved ones come in the room. People see that the whole room fills with light. And most strikingly to me, I guess the strangest thing I know about this whole field is that in many cases I've studied over the years, the bystander at the death of someone else, that as the person is dying, will themselves empathically co-participate in the dying life review of the person there. And this to me is startling information, and it makes me try to come up with some reason that I could get myself recused from my life review, because, the idea of itself is enough to scare you, to worry about. But, the idea of having a spectator there, these people pass the popcorn. But it happens. And happens not just to people, as I would have thought, who are intimate and know the person well. But in one case, a medical doctor told me of seeing his dying patient's life review, who had never even laid his eyes on the patient before. He's just called to the ER. So what I'm talking about is that something odd is going on here that does not fit into the view of reality that we're pretty much forced to maintain, in everyday life. So but the older you get, the more you're amenable to explore these things. I noticed that the older I get, the more of my friends who are my age have had some kind of experience in their life, which is like stepping over into some other realm of existence. And so where I've come on it is I give up. After really thinking it out, what got to me was, see, I have a lot of friends who are medical doctors whose medical judgment I would trust 100% if something happened to me. And those same friends of mine tell me that, yeah, they had this near-death experience. And not only was it real, but it was more real than this ordinary reality. And the incredible things that happen, if you know the story probably of Anthony Chicoria, PhD in physiology, MD, a professor of orthopedic surgery at NYU, who had a profound near-death experience and in 1994 was struck in the head by a bolt of lightning, had a cardiac arrest, and was at a family reunion, was able to look all around and saw all of his, saw his relatives who were there at the reunion at the resort center, even though he was, lying by the fun, apparently dead. And, Anthony said, this is more real than real. And then Anthony, who had never had any interest in music, started getting fascinated by the piano, started having dreams in which he was playing a piano on a concert stage, playing the same music, learned how to play the piano, and transcribed this music, and is now, in addition to being a renowned orthopedic surgeon, as a famed concert pianist too. I mean, see, things like that don't make any sense if this world is as we think by common sense that it is constituted. Now, what if I am an addict of, not a virtue person, an addict of exercise? I gotta get out every day and walk. Okay. It's like I ask myself, if heaven forbid something were to happen to my foot, would I entrust my foot to Anthony Chicoria, knowing he's out? Yes, absolutely. So see, and I could go on with a dozen other physicians, that same story, but I give up because I can't figure out how I could reconcile the fact that I would put myself in these doctor's hands, in a life or death situation, with the fact that they all tell me that this thing is more real than any reality that I've experienced. And so to me, that I give up. I can't, because I can't think my way out of that one.
I think as human beings, we're hardwired not to believe. Maybe it's to be tied in with the game of life. I'm not
there
sure.
There you go.
I've experienced miracles myself, but I wake up in the morning thinking, is this all real?
Yeah.
I think almost everybody's experienced some kind of a miracle, and they don't recognize it or they don't want to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start to mention, for instance, with shared death experiences, which is what this book is about, if you start to talk to people about what you're working on, almost everybody will say, well, I've had an experience like that. And I didn't talk about it because I thought people would think I was wacky, or I just never thought it was an appropriate conversation. For whatever reason, they don't like to bring it up. Once you bring it up, though, you start to open up the flower, as it were, and people start to deliver information that you previously didn't know was out there. That's how it was with near-death experiences. And this book is vastly different from near-death experiences because it's about shared death experiences, which are experiences that take place with people who are essentially at the bedside of someone who's dying, and they share their death experience.
Right.
Yeah.
Just just stories flood your mind. I saw this old Maynard guy who was in his 80s, who was a GP in Maine, rural Maine, for all of his career. And he was telling me, this was at the Council Grove Consciousness seminar that was put on by the Miniature Foundation. And he was saying that he had this patient he had had a long time. She was elderly, and she had hypertension, and she had what we call a cor bovina, which is a big round heart. And it's caused by, if the high blood pressure over a long period of time, the heart sometimes just comes out and looks kind of round from pressure. It's like a cow heart. And these hearts are very irritable. And so this woman, who was, I think, in her 90s, I'm pretty sure he said, and they kept going, and then her heart would stop, and then they would zap her, and she's back. And finally, she said to this guy, the doctor, and she said, look, I'm sick of this. Please just let me go. I'm 90, whatever, please. And so, but that's an easy thing to say, right? Doctor, let me go. But think of it from the point of view of the doctor or the nurse. They're trained to. It's just a different. And so, but anyway, this woman had a friend there with her, this other woman that she had known, just decades and decades. And so her friend was there with her in the hospital. So the friend said, well, I'll be with her, and just everybody back off. Then next time it happens, I'll just let her die. So all that was, the medical people backed off. Then pretty soon, indeed, the elderly woman did the heart stop and all, but her friend was embracing her at this time. And incredibly, when the friend felt the heart stop, it startled her, and she jerked, and because the heart is so, irritable, bump, bump, bump again. I'm sorry, I won't do it again. So, that was the dress rehearsal. Now everybody backs off. Then the next time, no problem. So the woman just passes away. But this doctor told me, he said the friend told him that as her friend was dying, she said she herself, the friend, went out of her body and was going up right with her friend toward this light. And she saw the people she recognized as the friends and relatives of her friend, and all of them had died and so on. And I mean, I could go on telling you hundreds, more than 100, as many as you want, stories like that. And it's this near-death experience is not something that is somehow generated by an oxygen deprived brain, but it's going to take something else than what we have for society to wake up with that, because this is too threatening for people, for many people otherwise. Some people can accept that there's an afterlife. This idea scares a lot of other people, so we're still going to be stuck for a while in this sort of framework, is the reality versus the oxygen deprivation. But one thing those folks never think of is, even if you could prove that it was not oxygen deprivation to the brain, that still wouldn't prove that it's life after death. See, so in a way, that is all irrelevant anyway. But it's because a certain kind of mind, they've got to have this kind of framework to process it. But when this is going to come all loose is when we can step outside of that framework and look at whole new possibilities about these near-death experiences.
Yeah. I'd like to just read the titles of your reasons, and then maybe we can talk about them. Again, this is from your book, which I really recommend everybody gets because it is loaded with stories. We love stories of what happens to people when we get the goosebumps of, the reunions and all that. This is from the Proof of Life After Life, 7 Reasons to Believe There Is an Afterlife. So it's all about the shared death experiences, but different kinds. So reason 1, out-of-body experiences. Reason 2, precognitive experiences. Number 3, the transforming light. Number 4, terminal lucidity. Number 5, spontaneous muses, healings, and skills. Reason number 6, light, mist, and music. And number 7, the psychomantium. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah,
That's it. Yeah.
So where do we begin? Because like I said, thank you for sending me a copy of the book before it's published. And for anybody who's watching, it's coming out very shortly, beginning of September 2023. You can pre-order it. You may already have a copy, depending on when you're watching it. But it's just chock full of stories that I love. So we're talking about different things. So out-of-body experiences. These are the things like the near-death experience, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
That's
it's
part of
near-death
it.
experience.
Yeah.
Okay. And precognitive experiences. It's tough when there's 3 of us together, but we'll go with it.
Yeah.
What's a precognitive experience?
Well, these are not all necessarily related to near-death experiences. I think that's the beauty of a shared death experience. A shared death experience is when someone who is well shares the death experience of someone who's dying. So in the case of a precognitive experience, it would be, as an example, we have a couple of case studies in here of people who had loved ones in China, and they were in England, and they wake up in the middle of the night and they see this person who's in China standing at the foot of their bed and tells them, "I'm dying. I've died, and I'll miss you." And then that's the end of the experience. But it's later proven that this person did die at the same time that they had appeared to this individual. And we have doctors who have seen their fathers. They've woken up and they've seen their fathers standing there. And the father says, you better talk to your mother because I've spoken to her and she knows that I'm dead. You better talk to your mother and get the facts. So that's precognitive. It's that kind of an experience. It's not necessarily related to a near-death experience, but it's very different. There's other ones. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Paul.
But there's other ones in here that aren't all related to near-death experiences, and I think that's really the power of this book, is that this book takes off from near-death experiences, which are subjective experiences. In other words, the person who has an NDE is the person who has it, and no one else has had it, and no one else can really experience what they experienced. But a shared death experience is when someone shares the experience of a dying individual. And that's what makes this book very different. So if you look at things like light, mist, and music, the chapter on light, mist, and music, we have, once again, a number of physicians who in a hospital have actually seen a light or a mist leave a person's body as they die. Or we have people who hear music when someone is dying. They'll be in the room and they'll hear music. And sometimes there might be several people in the room with this individual who hear music and then several who don't. And that's one of the puzzles of shared death experiences.
Right.
Absolutely. Dr. Moody?
You were mentioning too earlier, Sandra, about out of body experiences, which are, yes, that is a rather mind boggling part of near death experiences, where people say that after they often say they hear the doctor pronounce them dead or say that they've died or whatever, but they say from their point of view, they feel that they actually leave their physical bodies and they drift up. Typically, in most of the stories I hear, that's in an operating room or medical facility or whatever. So, in those circumstances, people say they can rise up. They see their body down below. They can see the doctors and nurses working on it, but that their consciousness is separated. And then they say in this circumstance, you can understand what the doctor or nurse or whoever are communicating, but you don't hear their voice. That you sort of pick up on what they're communicating by mind. Just and also that when they try to communicate in turn, that nobody can hear them. So they're kind of walled off, and they say that it kind of dawns on them that this might be connected with what we call death. And so with that realization, they say they go through this passageway into another world. But those out of body experiences are very characteristic of near death experiences, but they also occur in other circumstances. Sometimes just spontaneously for reasons unknown. I have a wonderful friend in Paris named Eric Pagani, who I think he used to be with NPR as an expert on classical music, as I call it. But he is a clinical psychologist, very well respected in France, and incidentally, the psychological director of Disneyland Paris, which is his favorite position, being a fan of Donald Duck as I am. And Eric is such a fine person. I mean, his parents must have just been completely kind to him. He's just the sweetest person in the world. But he's a psychologist. He writes for psychology and is an expert in there. But he's also a concert pianist. And Eric was telling me in 1988, we were together, and he said he was playing this piece. And that on stage, and all of a sudden he felt himself leave his body. He could see his body down below. He was in this light. And 17 minutes later, he came back to the keyboard, and 17 minutes and three pieces he had played. But in his point of view, it was out there. And, Eric is so modest. So I said, well, did the people appreciate the music? And, he's so much, oh, yes, they seem to. His sister happened to be there, had been there at this concert. And she said, as a matter of fact, that people were yelling, screaming, and shoving them down. And so he said, well, if, I'm a psychologist, he said, if this happened to me, it's happened to other musicians. So he made had a lot of friends who were operatic singers. So he surveyed them, and he found, many cases where people in singing great music will just be transported out of their bodies. And it happens too, see, in the verge of death. We have many cases of people who people, their relatives who've left behind said he had never any interest in poetry or music. But just before he died, he started composing poetry or reciting poetry as they're dying, and sometimes singing as they are dying. And see, this is a common phenomenon, and far less common than near-death experiences. But if you have a room full of of 150, 200 people, and you raise this question, anybody ever hear of this among their family? I guarantee you 2 or 3 people, well, yeah. And if you have the right perspective, you realize this is vast. Even Socrates had this during his dying experience, as recorded by Plato, that even though he had never had any interest in music and kind of disdained it, like the day of just a few days before he's dying, he got dreams and visions to tell him to write verse. And he compared it to the swan song. The Greeks believed that just as before swans die, they sing the most beautiful song at all. And so Socrates saying, the reason they do it is that they know that they're going to shortly be joined with the gods. And so I remember reading that and being impressed at the age of 18. Flash forward to 1972, and I saw that very thing. Or no, 1974. I saw that very thing happen before my eyes when we were trying to resuscitate an elderly lady who was reciting poetry. She was dying. And, what is this? Well, it's a common thing, but we don't know much about it.
It's fascinating.
We had one really incredible story from the 1930s of a woman who had meningitis as a child, and as a result was essentially non-functional her entire life. She fouled herself. She couldn't speak. She couldn't communicate in much of any way at all. And then as she was dying, she started singing. And she started singing a song. She had never communicated, like I say, anything before. She started singing a song, sang it so beautifully that the medical staff was weeping, and they were all pouring into her room to hear this phenomenon take place. And she seemed to have acquired information. She seemed to have acquired knowledge in her final moments. She sang, and then shortly thereafter, she died. Yeah. And that's also known as terminal lucidity, where someone becomes very lucid at the point of being terminal.
Sandra, I am a social phobe, and in my own kind of restricted social network, I had one dear friend that I knew for years who sang as she died. And I had a dear friend who told me that his brother did the same thing. His brother was dying. So that's just from my own association.
There are people,
and so
too,
that means there's lots of this.
I was just thinking there are people too that, whether it's dementia, Alzheimer's, that there's nothing left, and then there are these bursts, or can be bursts of, they recognize everybody in the room, perhaps. That's right. See into beyond. Is that all could be tied in with this terminal?
Yes, this is terminal lucidity. That's right.
Great cases. There was one written about in Time magazine where a doctor wrote about an oncologist, and this person he was talking about had essentially a head full of tumors. And he was just dead. He was essentially living dead. But at the last moment, when his children came into the room, he popped out of it. And he spoke with great lucidity about how pleased he was to be their father, and what he would like to see continue in the family. And they thought, he's healed, we can take him home. And within a few hours, he passed away. That's the story of terminal lucidity. It's I think it's going to be one of the most common paranormal experiences.
Yeah, Sandra, it's people used to know about this as just folk knowledge, and because they called it faith, F-E-Y, I think, was, if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, the sort of central definition of that is a state of extraordinary enhanced consciousness that portends imminent death. And people knew about that when people died at home. But then people started dying in the hospital. But see, if anybody, I mean, I can attest this. I obviously, one of my activities as a medical doctor, a lot of it had to do with the terminally ill, because I was known for that, and people would call me in and so on. And anybody who is in that situation for any period of time, hospice workers or whatever, you're going to see this. And the trouble is, when you describe it, it's like nobody can believe it. I know the description, but all right, here is the description. It's like, as a person died, they've even been diminished. I mean, it's like no communication for a long time. And then as they die, here you go, hold on to your hat. They light up, I swear to you. And it's not the light coming from a light bulb or from the sun. It's coming from inside of them. It's just this pure light.
It's also called a lightening experience, by the way.
Yeah. And people, it's like they become completely coherent. It's like my uncle, as he was dying, went around and gave a message to everybody in the family personally, just to his immediate family, but it was just the same thing, something to every, and he had been, up ton for this, it's just, and yet, that if you talk about this, nobody else who hasn't seen it is even capable of believing it. And maybe they shouldn't be. I mean, I don't know that people should necessarily accept this on the basis of what some expert says. But it's because it makes no sense unless you've seen it. But it is incredible. I had this guy was a well-known oncologist. And he was telling me, and he was, I guess, in his 70s when he was telling me this. He said he had this patient he had been dealing with for a long time. And so the patient had died. And so they had covered the patient up with the sheet. So the doctor was standing around with the family, who he had known all a long time. And suddenly they saw the twitch from under the sheet and get it up, and he sits up and he starts talking to everybody very coherently. And this one, and then he just sort of sat back down, dead. And my friend said, he said, unless those other people had been there with me, he said, I would have concluded that I had had a hallucination. It's just that uncanny when you see it, really is.
Oh,
And what is that? It's people who experience.
I think it's more common than people recognize.
Yes, absolutely.
It's now starting to be included on whatever the medical records are of patients. There's now a description on some of the description of terminal lucidity, and it just happened. And now they're starting to find that it's quite common.
Yeah. And bystanders often say, is what this man flew all the way from Australia to see me, to tell me about the experience he had with his wife when he was dying, which just told, and they had known each other a long time, and she was going down, down, and down, to his horror. And then he said one evening he was getting ready to go to the store for a minute. And so he just wanted to come in there and be right back. But when he walked in the room, he said it was like, oh my God, she's perking up. And it was like they had a really heartfelt conversation. And he thought that she's turning around. Yeah. So he went to the store, and as you can imagine, when he came back, she was dead. And I will remember that look on his face when he told me. He said, it was like, he said, she already had one foot on the other side, and the mystified look on his face. And it is, it's not something that is easy to put aside as oxygen deprivation to the brain. I'll tell you that.
Not once people can see loved ones. I mean, one of my friends, when his father died, no one had told him that a couple of his friends had passed away. And,
Yeah,
he, same thing, terminal
right.
lucidity. And he's looking around and he's seeing Joe and he's seeing Bob. And they're like, no one ever told him.
That's right.
Yeah, these experiences are amazing. I mean, in putting together this book, I feel like I've heard everything and seen everything, and I discovered that wasn't true in putting this book together. One of the things that was very unique to me is that years ago, if you told a doctor you were working on a book on near-death experiences, many of them would poo-poo it. They would deny that it took place. Now you start to hear stories from physicians, and many of the stories are in this book. We have a large number of physician stories, and then some of them, like one that really amazes me, is people who see a mist coming out of someone who's dying.
Yeah.
Because not only have we spoken to several doctors who have seen this come out of people who are dying, but the description of what happens is the same. Is that they'll see a mist, and the mist forms and seems to get sucked into a tube or sucked into some hole
Or disappear through the
it just
ceiling.
disappears through the ceiling. I mean, the description is the same, which is good news because it means that it's a legitimate phenomenon. If it repeats certain elements, it's a legitimate phenomenon.
Yeah, and what is that? And and like, why would there be a need? I mean, I just gotta say, I can't. I mean, I gotta be honest. I've seen it myself. I mean, I just holy mackerel, what was that?
Mhm.
And I mean, I give up. And why is it? It presents itself as a mist to us because a mist is a symbol of the unknown or the unknowable, I guess. And it's clouds themselves, which we now understood. You remember in the 8th grade, you learned that system of classifying the 4 types: the cumulus and the stratus and cirrus and nimbus and that came about in the 1830s because up to that time, the common sense was that clouds are unknowable because they unintelligible, ephemeral, changeable, and they were the very symbol people. It was what the people symbolized: unknowability or unintelligibility, that it's unstable. And because knowledge, by contrast, is something solid and stable, so that knowledge of the clouds would, by definition, be. And people were ridiculed, like up in the clouds, we say, and in the clouds, we still say those things. But that was something utterly unintelligible and beyond reason and knowledge. Then this guy named Luke Howard, who was a pharmacist and who traveled in his business back and forth, was just interested in this, got to watching clouds through the carriage or whatever, just drawing them. And then he realized, oh my God, there's different types of them. Some of them are big and puffy. So he published this paper from a scientific society he belonged to. And it created a sensation because, as you can imagine, anybody who cared to read the paper and then wanted to walk outside could see he was right. Right? Because we can all see it for ourselves once you. And so I think, something like that has got to happen because this is so. What in the world are we dealing with a mist coming out of somebody's body when they die? I give up.
Do you guys think that being in the present moment and kind of having a peaceful mind lends to being, having one of these shared death experiences? Because you said some people have them and some people don't. But I know most people that I see are so busy on their phones.
That's right.
and so worried, are they going to be present where you say a physician there in the moment of someone's passing? Doctors, you want to believe, are really in the present moment to someone's health. And maybe that's being
Well,
more present lends to more of
I
this.
think there's a number of factors. I think you do have to have a peaceful mind, a present mind, uh, but you also have to have a lot of empathy. I think empathy is a real factor in all these experiences.
Interesting.
Uh, people with empathy can be in a room with someone who's dying, and they can lend their empathy to the person. And sometimes other people just can't do it. They just can't be around someone who's dying.
Yeah.
They can't be present. They want to get away from the present.
I tell you, it's just, it is a mystery when a person who almost dies has an experience of seeing another world. And it's a mystery multiplied when a bunch of people see see an afterlife, the death of somebody else. But the reality is we just don't have the mind to compute it. My hero of the afterlife thinking is still David Hume, the great skeptic who influenced Einstein, for example. He was 1711 to 1776, the archetype of the skeptic. He was so skeptic, he said, as to the impressions which arise from their senses, he said it's utterly beyond the rational possibility to determine whether those things arise from the objects or are from the creative power of our mind or from the author of our being. You can't really decide. It's like the whole assumption that we live in a physical world. That is all a product of consciousness and inferences about consciousness. And that's the real deal. And Hume said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Now, there's an understatement. And he went on to say, some new species of logic is required for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. Now, that is the brute reality. That's the fact. No matter what anybody wants to say, that's the real fact. And so, see, it's traditionally been thought that that's the end of it, that's impossible to me. I say, no, absolutely not. We can do it. There are new ways of thinking logically. And as Sandra and I have talked about before, and that if you apply these new principles of logic, you can open faculties of your mind you didn't know you had. Mm-hmm. And that when you put those things together, we can actually prepare our minds in advance so that when subsequently we happen to have a near-death experience, we can come back and tell everybody else about it in a whole new way. I guarantee you it's already happened. And it will happen again in the future. So what I'm saying is, if you're curious about the afterlife and all, what do we mean in this book by proof of an afterlife? I'm a logician. I've studied proof. There's all different kinds of proofs. What I want to say here is there proof of an afterlife? That's what most people want to know. And from what I have studied and what I've listened to lots of people about what they mean when they're trying to say, what kind of proof do you want? What I can say is this. I can say that as a logician, a person who's taught logic and philosophy, I can say that it is a rational thing for you to anticipate that when you die, some amazing thing is going to happen that will sort of transfer you into a whole different level of reality. And that's what I'm anticipating, not because I want to believe it. I mean, I'm not sure I want to believe it or not. It's not a matter of believing or disbelieving. It is for me. And so in that sense, yeah, there's a proof. There's for those who, not symbolic logicians or whatever, but just ordinary folks wanting to know, is there a rational basis for this? Say absolutely. Absolutely.
It's good news. Paul, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I heartily concur with that. And I know did want to mention that there's a lot of people who want to know how to access Heaven's Gate, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the theories they've come up with is the theory of background information. And what that says is that on a daily basis, we're hit by thousands, if not millions, of bits of information. Everything you see visually to everything you read, all your opinions, your own self-talk and other people's talk. And that what happens when people reach the state of having an afterlife open up to them is that somehow all of this background information, the unnecessary information, is cleared out of their mind, and they're able to focus on the real background information, which is what happens to us on a supernatural way. And to do that, many people have done deep meditations. They've done dark room meditations, things like that. And there's still a long way to go in figuring out how to access this afterlife, if you will. But that's one theory of it, that once you clean out the background information, you have an open gate, if you will.
I like it. What's the psychomantium?
Okay.
Well, that's something I found out about when I was 18 years old, which I thought was hogwash. But I am a great fan of the Greeks. And when I was 18, I had a great course reading Herodotus, the historian, who's the founder of history as we know it. And I was reading it. He says, this king, Periander, had misplaced something that a friend of his had left for him to keep. So he said he didn't know how to find it. So he sent a delegation to the Oracle of the Dead among the Thesprotians on the river Acco. And they called up the spirit of his wife, Melissa, and she told them, the information. So I was reading this and it was presented so matter of factful, And I said, what's this? Because I had a great respect for Herodotus, but I knew at age 18 that could happen. So but then that same semester, I learned about, these ancient Greek oracles of the dead. They wrote about them. They had places where you could go through procedures, and you would seem to see and talk to deceased relatives. And so, to make a very long story short, I also studied psychiatry and altered states of consciousness. I had been studying for some time the phenomenon of where if you have a vacant space in your visional field, like a glittering space or a clear depth, they call it, like you can take a silver bowl and highly polish it on the inside, fill it with olive oil, and then in a darkened room, you gaze by candlelight or some low illumination. You gaze into that. And many people under those circumstances have these hypnagogic visions where they see this very lifelike, not like mental imagery, but very lifelike three-dimensional vision. And I had known about that, and I experimented with my psychology students. But in 1985, 6, 7, I found in an archaeological journal that an archaeologist I already knew about, Soterios Dokaris, he was a very famous Greek classical archaeologist, had rediscovered this place, the Oracle of the Dead, and had excavated it. Based on what they found, there was in the apparition chamber, they found a large cauldron, bronze cauldron, and it was surrounded by a balustrade. This was obviously the place you saw the visions, and there was torch marks on the wall showing it was illuminated. You stayed down there for 29 days, talking about the person who died and so on. Then you went into a cut stone maze in complete darkness, felt your way into this chamber, and there, gazing into this apparition, into this, you saw the apparitions. Soterios hadn't figured that part out. I had figured that part out, and so I went to his place in 93 or something, 94, and I told him about, no, I think what it is this, because I had recreated it by then. And he said, yeah, like then he realized, he showed me some books of people seeing, he had just never put two and two together. But I tried it out. You just set up a room where there's a mirror, and it's a darkened room, but the mirror is placed higher than your line of vision, so you don't see your reflection. The room is darkened. You don't see reflections. There's a gentle light behind you, illuminated just gently. But the primary thing is the preparation, like you talk about with your friend, like the person who died. What was this person like? What are your best memories? What are your sticking points in the relationship? So then after this preparation, you go in there and you just gaze into the mirror, and people have extraordinary things. I was not expecting what the result. My graduate students of psychology then, as time went, my medical colleagues, a psychiatry colleague, and a clinical psychologist colleague, and a sociology colleague, and an anesthesiologist were my subjects. And these were people who were informed about the mind. So I figured that if anybody that did have a vision, that say, yeah, Raymond, I saw my grandma, or was it real or was it fair? I don't know. That was what I was expecting. But imagine my surprise when my colleagues and graduate students came out of there, not saying I saw him, but yeah, I talked to my grandma. And it was startling to me. It was a way, I had no idea of what I tapped into. And what people say is that some say the image appears in the mirror, and others say that, yeah, the image appears in the mirror, but then the image comes out into the room, and they see them right to you. Once in a while, people get bugged or whatever. Then other people say, yeah, I was sitting there in the chair, but my consciousness went through the mirror, and there's another dimension where they met with their deceased relatives. But and I had been expecting to say, oh, I don't know what is real or not. No, people say, I saw my grandma. They interpret it as a real event. And it's about 30% of them hear what seems an audible voice, but they say it's like amplified. Like there's one woman who had worked in telephony told me that she said it sounds kind of something like when you hear voice coming through telephone line. She said like an amplification. I heard that too, part of it, when I heard my grandma. And so people, the other 70% or so who don't hear an audible voice, say that the communication is heart to heart or mind to mind. And so what is this? I give up. But we know for sure that it helps people with grief. I had not anticipated that part of it, to tell you the truth, but people say, yeah, it really helps them through the grief. And then all kinds of wild things happen. Like, not that it's wild in itself, I know, but one of the things that happens, and about a quarter of them say that they saw some other deceased person known to them who had died, rather than or in addition to the person they came to see. So it doesn't necessarily go on what you would wish. One woman that happened to, she said, I realized, she said, the person I wanted to see was my husband. The person I needed to see was my father. So she prepared to see her father. And so, what's going on here again? I don't know.
Well, also, Raymond, there was one case where a woman came to see her deceased daughter, was unable to see her, and this was in the afternoon, was unable to see her. She went back to the hotel with her sister who had traveled with her. And they talked about what had transpired, which she had failed to see her daughter, when suddenly these orbs appeared in the room.
It's just, and these people are just like as earthy and grounded. I mean, so I'm sorry, Paul.
So 3 orbs appeared in the room, and they moved around this woman. One of them moved close to her, and she started to communicate with her psychically with this orb, and felt as though her daughter was in that orb. This was at 3:30 in the afternoon, so the room was bright. Her sister luckily took 3 photographs of it, and I can send you the photos for this show if you'd like. And there's these orbs, and this woman communicated with her daughter through one of these orbs, which that was the first actual case I had seen, because I've seen a lot of these cases where we had visual proof of something coming out of the mirror. And I've encouraged Raymond before to maybe put a camera in the psychomantium chamber to see if anything does come out of the mirror, but you can't really do that because it's kind of a violation of privacy.
Well, also, I mean, I can't use cameras. I had to give up my camera years ago when they got clamps down on the airplanes. I couldn't take my magnesium powder anymore from my flash. So,
yeah.
Well, gentlemen, time has gone by pretty quick. You're loaded with stories. And in just a second, I want to ask if you guys have a closing word or two before we depart, but just a couple of announcements for our listeners or our viewers. First of all, I want to remind you this book that we're talking about, and there's lots of books to explore, is Proof of Life After Life, 7 Reasons to Believe There Is an Afterlife. And I love that there are so many doctors included. And for me, it's stories. Stories, they give me goosebumps, but they just help me personally live a better life to know that there's so many reasons to believe in the afterlife. And I think that's one of the main reasons we want to know our loved ones live on. Yes, we do. We want to know we live on, but we want to have a good life while we're here. So if we can take away that fear and that constant thinking about death and just have that faith and that trust that something extraordinary happens, let's do it. So Proof of Life After Life. Also, Dr. Moody's website is lifeafterlife.com, and Paul's website is paulperryproductions.com. There's pages there with all the books written. There's so much material. There's no way we can get through everything in an hour. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. I know, gentlemen, the people that follow this show, they love to know. And so I know we're getting a lot of people that are interested in reading the book and watching your videos and seeing so much more. And our home base is wedon'tdie.com. Again, this is episode 405, which is crazy. Wow. Crazy. So, I am really passionate about this too. So you can feel free to come join me. Every Sunday, we do a free Sunday service online. It is super fun, but there's a medium demonstration included that just shows how close our loved ones truly are. And if you'd like a free copy of my book, you can just join my email list at the bottom of the wedon'tdie.com page. It says it's just the first few chapters. The secret is it is the entire book, because chapter 10 is how to survive grief. Grief, I think, brings a lot of us to the conversation, and it's his own kind of beast. And there are some things we can do to help lessen the pain, move through it, feel better. And I just want to give you everything I know about that. So, gentlemen, one at a time, some closing words, and then we'll let you fine people have dinner tonight. Dr. Moody?
Well, for the folks listening and watching in, thank you so much for spending this time. And I'm just so I'm struck beyond words that people will listen to what I have to say. I obviously love talking about it, and so I hope that what I've said has helped you and been interesting to you. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Paul?
Well, I want to thank everybody for being open-minded enough to sit through this and understand that there's a lot of different things going on in the world that if they're open to them, it opens more and more and more. So thank you very much for joining us, and hope to see and hear you again. Bye-bye.
Oh, thanks so much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, my name is Sandra Champlain. I'm always so happy to be your host on We Don't Die Radio. I personally do believe that life is an education for the soul and that our lives here on earth are important. I think it's just a matter of time before we each have one of those experiences and go looking for them. They're real. And be comforted that those last few moments, you never know what's going to happen before we transition to the other side. But I say we can get a whole lot of joy and pleasure out of this life. If it is an illusion, this thing called death, there are miracles that we can have while we're here on earth. We can go out, we can love, we can push the envelope into our things we fear. And there's all kinds of things that are possible when we just get outside of our comfort zone. So I'm Sandra Champlain. Thank you for listening or for watching, and we'll see you again soon.